What was that?
I don't know!
Is everyone okay?
The laser dot was a heartbeat away from his temple, and I was the only person in the room who wasn't supposed to exist. My fingers fumbled with the small card, the edges sharp against my palm as I tucked it under the silver water carafe. Around me, the rooftop lounge vibrated with the heavy bass of Atlanta's elite, the clink of top-shelf bourbon, the rustle of tailored silk, the smell of expensive cologne masking the scent of fear. Outside, the humid southern night pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass, but in the distance, the shadows on the adjacent rooftop were cold and mechanical. Inside, the chandeliers threw warm golden light across the table, making everything feel safe. It was a lie. I moved toward table 1 like a ghost walking through a minefield. Choi Hyun-soo sat with the discipline of a soldier, his black suit sharp enough to cut, his neck tattoos disappearing into his collar like ink-stained secrets. He looked like a king carved from obsidian, fingers gripped tight around a crystal glass. Across from him, his brother Min Jae leaned back, a luxury watch glinting on his wrist and a smile on his face that looked like brotherhood. It wasn't. 10 minutes ago, I'd found the phone that proved Min Jae had already sold his brother's life for a ghost's price. Welcome back, my shadow dwellers and midnight dreamers. Who do you think is more dangerous, the enemy you see or the brother you trust? The scent of expensive cedar and ironed linen lingered in the VIP booth, a ghostly reminder of the power that had just occupied the space. I moved with the practiced invisibility of a woman whose job was to clean up after the gods of Atlanta. My apron felt heavy, weighed down by the coins of people who didn't know my name, but my mind was miles away, tallying the cost of my mother's next dialysis treatment. That was when I saw it. Tucked deep into the crevice of the dark leather seating was a burner phone, a sleek, anonymous piece of plastic that looked entirely out of place in a lounge where even the napkins cost more than my shoes. It belonged to Min Jae. I'd seen him sliding it into his pocket earlier, his quiet, unsettling smile never reaching his eyes as he toasted to his brother's health. I didn't intend to be a thief. I intended to return it. But as my fingers brushed the screen, it pulsed with the blue light of an incoming notification. The phone wasn't locked. Min Jae was many things, but perhaps his arrogance was his only blind spot. I retreated into the shadows of the service station, my heart drumming against my ribs. The text on the screen was short, a surgical strike of data that turned my blood to ice. Offshore accounts drained. 4.2 billion won moved to private ledger. The birds are on the nest, 10:15 p.m. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, 10:11 p.m. A second message scrolled upward, an image attachment that made the air in the lounge feel thin and suffocating. It was a photo of Choi Hyun-soo, taken from a high-angle vantage point, a red crosshair centered perfectly over his heart. Below it, a single command: confirm kill on the brother, total erasure. Min Jae hadn't just taken the money, he was selling the family throne for a pile of ash and a clean slate. My hands shook, the phone nearly slipping from my grip as I realized the victory gala he'd been planning wasn't a celebration, it was a funeral. Through the slats of the service divider, I looked at table 1. Hyun-soo sat there, a monolith of disciplined power, his faint neck tattoos tracing the lines of a man who survived 1,000 wars only to be betrayed by the blood he shared. He was drinking bourbon, leaning forward to listen to a lie Min Jae was telling with a smile. I knew then that I couldn't just walk away. My mother needed the money, and this world was a wild animal I should have avoided, but mercy wasn't a business decision. I grabbed a small service card from the station, my pen scratching against the paper with a desperate, jagged energy. I wasn't a player in their game, but I was the only variable they didn't see coming. The golden light of the chandeliers felt like a spotlight on my back as I stepped out of the shadows. Every step toward table 1 felt like a march toward a ledge.
I carried a silver water carafe like a shield, my knuckles white against the handle. Min-jae was laughing now, a sound like glass breaking, his hand resting casually near the table near his brother's arm. He looked so relaxed, so innocent, while 10:15 p.m. crawled closer on the digital clock. I reached the table, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my chest. Hyun-soo didn't look up at first. He was the picture of obsidian cold discipline, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. But as I leaned in to refill the water, I felt the sudden sharp weight of his attention. He was a predator. He knew when the air changed. My hand shook just enough to rattle the crystal as I slid the small service card onto the linen, pinning it beneath the base of his glass. Min-jae's eyes flickered to me, his smile sharpening into a question. I didn't wait for him to speak. I turned on my heel, my breath hitching in my throat as I retreated. Behind me, the silence was a physical weight. I watched through the reflection in a nearby wine cooler as Hyun-soo's large tattooed hand reached for the glass. He didn't drink. He tilted the card, his wide, startled eyes scanning the jagged ink. I saw the moment the truth hit him, the way his jaw locked and his mouth hung slightly open in a silent, jagged gasp. He looked at his brother, then at the window, the card crumbling in his grip like a dying thing. "Hyun-soo," Min-jae's voice was smooth, a silken trap. "What is it?" Hyun-soo didn't answer. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling glass, his pupils dilating as he spotted the same silhouettes I had. Crack. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a high-velocity snap that turned the world upside down. The glass panel behind Hyun-soo didn't just break, it atomized, 1,000 diamonds of safety glass spraying across the table. The bullet missed his temple by an inch, burrowing into the mahogany pillar with a dull thud. The screams didn't start for another 2 seconds. In that frozen window of time, the peaceful restaurant was dead. Min-jae was already diving for the floor, his face a mask of calculated panic, but Hyun-soo remained upright for a heartbeat longer, his eyes locked on mine across the chaos. He wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for the variable that had saved his life. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward into the rain of glass, grabbing the sleeve of his sharp black suit. "The kitchen!" I screamed over the first wave of panic. "Now!" The air in the lounge was no longer filled with the hum of wealth. It was a vacuum of terror, punctured by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed rifles chewing through the upholstery. I didn't look back to see if Min-jae was truly cowering or simply waiting for his brother's blood to pool. I kept my grip on Hyun-soo's sleeve, pulling him toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen. Hyun-soo moved with me, his shock hardening into a lethal, focused gravity. He was too large, too visible in his charcoal suit, a target made of shadow against the white-tiled walls of the prep station. We burst into the kitchen, a chaotic symphony of clattering copper pans and shouting line cooks who had yet to realize the war had arrived. "The freight elevator," I gasped, dodging a tray of hors d'oeuvres that scattered across the floor like discarded pearls. "They'll be watching the main lifts."
"How do you know the way?" Hyun-soo asked, his voice a low vibration near my ear. He wasn't panting, he was scanning the room, his hand reaching for a heavy chef's knife from a magnetic strip as we passed. "I've spent 3 years learning every crack in this building to avoid the managers," I replied, my heels clicking a frantic code against the linoleum. "Left, behind the industrial fridge." We rounded the corner just as the service doors behind us flew open. 2 men in tactical Navy gear, Min-jae's private security, spilled into the kitchen. They didn't shout warnings, they raised their weapons. I shoved Hyun-soo toward the alcove of the freight elevator, my heart leaping into my throat as the first round sparked off the stainless steel of the refrigerator. Hyun-soo reacted before I could scream. He didn't flee, he pivoted, his body a coil of disciplined violence. He launched the heavy knife with a fluid, terrifying precision. It didn't kill, but it found the shoulder of the lead gunman, sending his aim wild. I slammed my palm against the elevator call button. The wait felt like an eternity, the mechanical groan of the cables sounding like a death knell. Hyunsu stood in front of me, his broad shoulders forming a human shield, his eyes locked on the kitchen entrance with a predatory intensity that made the air feel electric. The doors groaned open. I grabbed his hand. His palm was hot, calloused and steady, and yanked him into the dim utilitarian cage. As the heavy steel gate began to slide shut, I saw Min-jae appear in the doorway. He wasn't hiding anymore. He stood behind his gunman, his face cold and calculating, his luxury watch catching the light as he checked the time. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a man watching a minor investment slip away. The elevator shuddered and began its slow, grinding descent into the bowels of the building. We were trapped in the dark, the scent of hydraulic fluid and Hyunsu's cedar cologne filling the small space. "You're bleeding," I whispered, noticing a crimson streak on his white collar where a glass shard must have grazed him. Hyunsu didn't look at the wound. He looked at me, his gaze tracing the lines of my face as if trying to memorize the woman who had just ruined his brother's masterpiece. "The money is gone, Nia," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "But my brother just made a fatal mistake. He left me with you." The freight elevator settled into the sub-basement with a heavy industrial groan that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. We stepped out into a corridor of raw concrete and shadow, far beneath the glitz of the rooftop lounge. Hyunsu moved with a grim, purposeful stride, his hand still hovering near the chef's knife tucked into his waistband. He led me toward a reinforced steel door at the end of the hall, the private treasury of the Choi Syndicate. "This vault requires a biometric scan and a physical key," Hyunsu muttered, his voice echoing off the cold walls. "Min-jae shouldn't have been able to touch it without me." He pressed his thumb to the glowing scanner. The light turned green, a series of heavy deadbolts sliding back with a sound like a thunderclap. But as the heavy door swung open, the air that rushed out wasn't filled with the scent of old paper and cold metal. It was empty. The vault was a hollow shell. The floor-to-ceiling shelves that should have held the lifeblood of his empire, stacks of cash, gold reserves, and physical ledgers, were stripped bare. Only a few scattered rubber bands and a layer of dust remained. The 4.2 billion won from the text message hadn't just been a number, it was the entire foundation of his power, vacuumed away by the brother who had shared his bread and his secrets. Hyunsu walked into the center of the room, his shoulders tensing as he realized the magnitude of the erasure. He looked like a king standing in a looted tomb. The disciplined mask he wore finally cracked, a raw, jagged disbelief flashing across his face before settling into a cold, terrifying stillness. He wasn't just a target anymore. He was a man without a country, without an army, and without a name. "He didn't just want me dead," Hyunsu whispered, his fingers curling into tight, white-knuckled fists. He turned back to me, the wide, startled expression from the restaurant returning for a fleeting second. For the first time, I didn't see the Mafia boss. I saw a man who had been stripped of everything he had spent a lifetime building. His gaze swept over the empty room, then settled on me, the waitress in a torn uniform who had ruined a masterpiece of betrayal. "You have no soldiers left to call, Nia, no accounts to pay for protection. My lieutenants will follow the money, and the money is in Min-jae's hands." He stepped closer, the heat radiating off him in the freezing basement. "You have nothing left. Why are you still standing here?" I looked at him, the weight of the burner phone in my pocket feeling like a leaden anchor. I thought of my mother, of the bills, and of the wild animals Min-jae had unleashed. "I'm the only person who knows what he did," I said, my voice steadying, "and because I don't leave people behind." Hyunsu reached out, his hand hesitating before his fingers brushed against my jaw, a touch that was surprisingly light for a man capable of such violence. The predatory rhythm of his heart seemed to sync with mine. He had lost an empire, but in the silence of the empty treasury, a new,
more dangerous alliance was beginning to breathe. The transition from the sterile, vaulted silence of the sub-basement to the humid, living noise of Atlanta's west side was a violent culture shock. I drove my beat-up sedan through a maze of cracked asphalt and flickering streetlights. The luxury of the rooftop lounge was nothing more than a fever dream. Hyun-soo sat in the passenger seat, his massive frame cramped and incongruous against the worn fabric, his charcoal suit smeared with the dust of his own ruined empire. He looked like a fallen god forced to walk among the mortals he had long forgotten. We pulled up to my apartment complex, a brick fortress where the air smelled of laundry soap, rain-slicked pavement, and the lingering spice of late-night cooking. The predatory rhythm of his world didn't exist here. Instead, there was a heavy, communal hum of survival. "My mother is sleeping in the back," I whispered, as I led him up the narrow, dimly lit stairwell. "Don't make a sound." Inside the small apartment, the space was cramped but meticulously kept. There were no crystal decanters or silk drapes. Instead, there were stacks of medical journals, boxes of dialysis supplies, and a small altar of family photos. I watched him as he took it in. He stood in the center of my living room, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling, his eyes tracing the fraying edges of the rug and the faded wallpaper. For a man who lived in glass towers, this was a tomb of a different kind. "You how you live?" Hyun-soo asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to vibrate the very walls. "While you serve water to men who spend your year's rent on a single bottle of wine?" "It's not just how I live, it's why I work," I said, moving to the kitchen to boil water. I didn't look back, but I felt his gaze on me, not as a waitress, but as a variable he was finally starting to solve. "In your world, power is something you take. In mine, it's something you maintain through sheer will." I turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, watching me with a look of profound, quiet realization. The wide, startled eyes from the restaurant were gone, replaced by a deep, searching respect. He saw the strength in the way I handled the medicine vials, the iron in my spine as I checked on my mother through the cracked bedroom door. He realized then that I wasn't a victim of my circumstances. I was the architect of a different kind of empire, one built on loyalty and blood that wasn't bought, but shared. "Min-jae thinks he won because he took the money," Hyun-soo said, his voice dropping to a jagged rasp. "But he forgot that money can't buy the kind of steel you have in your hands, Nia." In the dim light of the kitchen, the distance between the Mafia boss and the waitress vanished. We were just two people in the dark, bound by a betrayal that had set the city on fire, and a strength that was thicker than water. The transition from nursing student to soldier didn't happen in a gym. It happened in the quiet, lethal hours before dawn in my living room. Hyun-soo moved like a shadow through my cramped apartment, his presence turning the domestic space into a tactical briefing room. He didn't start with a gun, he started with a mirror. "Your eyes are too honest, Nia," he whispered, standing behind me as I stared at my reflection. "In my world, honesty is a scent that attracts sharks. You have to learn to lie with your pulse, not just your lips." He taught me the social warfare of the elite, the way a tilt of the head could signal submission or a hidden threat, and how to read the micro-expressions of men who had been born into treachery. We spent hours dissecting the hierarchy of the Choi Syndicate. He showed me how to identify the lieutenants who were motivated by greed and those who were driven by fear. I wasn't just learning to survive, I was learning to dismantle Min-jae's stolen empire from the inside out. When the physical training began, it was brutal. My hands, once softened by lotions and dishwater, began to blister and harden. Hyun-soo was a demanding teacher, his voice a low, jagged rasp that pushed me past my breaking point. He showed me how to conceal a ceramic blade in the hem of a dress, and how to use a target's own momentum to crush their windpipe. "You aren't a waitress anymore," he said one night, his hand steadying mine as I leveled a compact Glock at a makeshift target.
You are the variable. You are the shadow they won't see until it's too late. The predatory rhythm he lived by began to infect my own movements. I found myself scanning every room for exits, watching the hands of strangers on the street, and listening for the telltale click of a safety being disengaged in the silence. But it wasn't just about violence, it was about the electric tension growing between us, a bond forged in the cold fire of shared survival. As I practiced the elegant, deceptive walk of a high society guest, Hyun-soo watched me with a gaze that had shifted from respect to something deeper, something that looked dangerously like devotion. I was shedding my old skin, the waitress uniform of my soul, falling away, to reveal a woman who could walk into a den of lions and come out wearing their pelts. Min-jae is throwing his Ascension Gala in 3 days, Hyun-soo said, his fingers brushing against the new calluses on my palm. He thinks he's celebrating his victory. He doesn't realize he's just setting the stage for his own execution. Are you ready to play your part? I looked at my reflection, no longer startled, no longer a bystander. I'm ready to take back what he stole. The scent of lilies and cold champagne was so thick it was almost suffocating, a floral shroud draped over the belly of the beast. I smoothed the fabric of my silk gown, a deep midnight emerald that felt like liquid armor. In the reflection of the elevators, the girl who worried about dialysis bills was gone. In her place was a woman with a predator's posture and a ceramic blade hidden against her thigh. I wasn't carrying a carafe of water tonight. I was carrying a death warrant. Min-jae's Ascension Gala was a masterclass in hubris. He had taken Hyun-soo's money and spent it on a celebration of his own betrayal. The ballroom was filled with the very lieutenants who had turned their backs on their true boss the moment the gold stopped flowing. I moved through the crowd with the graceful, deceptive gait Hyun-soo had taught me, my eyes scanning the room for the gaps in the security grid. You look like you belong here. Hyun-soo's voice crackled softly in my earpiece, a low, grounding vibration. He was perched on a rooftop 300 yards away, watching the heat signatures through a high-powered scope. Don't forget the rhythm, Nia. Stay invisible in plain sight. I approached the VIP lounge where Min-jae sat like a king on a stolen throne. He was holding court, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand and a cigar in the other. His quiet, unsettling smile was broader than usual, fueled by the arrogance of a man who thought he had erased his only rival. I slipped past the velvet ropes, playing the part of a bored socialite looking for a light. As I leaned over the mahogany side table, my fingers moved with surgical precision. I planted the first microbug beneath the lip of the table, then another behind the heavy velvet derps. The inheritance is settled, Min-jae said, his voice dripping with cold confidence. He didn't even lower his tone. He believed the room was his. Hyun-soo's blood paid for the entry fee, and the offshore accounts are officially under my thumb. By tomorrow, the Choi Syndicate will be a memory. I didn't just take his money, I took his heir. The recording light on my wristcom pulsed a steady, silent red. Every word of his confession, every detail of the theft and the hit was being beamed directly to the servers Hyun-soo and I had prepared. This wasn't just evidence, it was the spark that would set his new kingdom on fire. Min-jae's eyes suddenly shifted towards me, his gaze lingering on the curve of my neck. For a terrifying second, the predatory rhythm of the room stuttered. I felt the weight of the ceramic blade against my skin, ready to finish what I'd started, but I didn't flinch. I gave him a slow, deceptive smile, the kind he used on his brother, and walked away into the shadows. The trap was set. The velvet silence of the gala shattered the moment the recording hit the house speakers. Min-jae's own voice, cold and boastful, roared through the ballroom, drowning out the string quartet. The lieutenants froze, glasses of champagne suspended in midair, as they heard their new king admit to hollowing out the treasury they were sworn to protect. The ascension was dying in real time. I saw Hyun-soo before anyone else did. He didn't sneak in, he burst through the center doors, a shadow born of the night, reclaiming his kingdom with every thunderous step. The crowd parted like a dark sea. He looked at his brother, and for a second the world narrowed to just the two of them, the soldier and the thief, separated by 20 feet of marble floor and a lifetime of resentment. "You were always too loud, Min-jae," Hyun-soo's voice boomed, raw and lethal. Min-jae didn't beg. The wicked brother dropped his glass, his face twisting into a mask of frantic, cornered rage. "Kill him!" he shrieked at the guards, but the men hesitated. The recording had sown the seeds of doubt, and in our world, doubt is a death sentence.
Realizing the tide had turned, Min-jae reached into the small of his back, pulling a chrome-plated pistol. He wasn't aiming for the guards, he was aiming for his brother's heart. I was already moving. The training from the cramped apartment floor kicked in, my body reacting before my mind could process the terror. I reached into the slit of my emerald gown, my fingers finding the cold, textured grip of the Glock. I didn't feel like a waitress or a nursing student. I felt like the variable. The world slowed to a crawl. I saw Min-jae's finger tightening on the trigger. I saw Hyun-soo lunging forward, too far away to stop the hammer from falling. I exhaled, just as Hyun-soo had taught me. I didn't think about the violence. I thought about the man who had stood as my shield in the freight elevator. I thought about the mother I had to protect. Crack. The recoil kicked against my palm, a sharp, honest jolt. The bullet found its mark with surgical precision, catching Min-jae in the shoulder just as he fired. His shot went wide, shattering a chandelier that rained crystal tears onto the floor. He tumbled backward, his weapon clattering away as he hit the marble with a heavy thud. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood there, the smoke curling from my barrel, my emerald silk shimmering under the broken lights. Hyun-soo stopped inches from his fallen brother. He didn't look at Min-jae. He turned his head, his dark eyes finding mine across the ruins of the banquet. In that look, the predatory rhythm finally broke, replaced by a searing, undeniable heat. The variable had saved the king. The heavy iron gates of the Choi estate hissed shut, sealing out the humid Atlanta night and the echoes of the gala's violence. Inside the study, the only light came from the fireplace, where the last of Min-jae's forged ledgers were turning into fragile gray flakes of ash. The wicked brother was gone, not to a grave, but to a silent, permanent exile in a place where his name carried no weight and his luxury watches couldn't buy a single favor. Hyun-soo had chosen a living death for him, a fate far more agonizing for a man who craved the spotlight. Hyun-soo stood by the hearth, the flickering orange glow dancing across the tattoos on his hands. He had discarded his torn jacket, his white shirt stained with the sweat and grit of a reclaimed kingdom. He looked back at the door as I entered. I had traded the emerald silk for a sharp, tailored black suit that fit me like a second skin. The transition was complete. The girl who once flinched at the sound of a raised voice now moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a woman who had looked into the abyss and didn't blink. "The lieutenants have been accounted for," I said, my voice steady, carrying the new authority he had helped me forge. "The accounts are being frozen, and the mother company has been alerted. Your empire is yours again, Hyun-soo." He didn't move toward the desk. He didn't reach for the brandy. He walked toward me, his presence filling the room until the air felt thick with that familiar electric tension. He stopped inches away, his dark eyes searching mine. The predatory rhythm was still there, but it was no longer directed at me. It was a pulse we shared. "It isn't my empire anymore, Nia," he said, his voice a low, resonant rasp. "A man who was saved by a ghost shouldn't rule alone. You saw the rot I was blind to. You held the line when my own blood failed." He reached into the humidor on the desk, but instead of a cigar, he pulled out a heavy obsidian seal, the mark of the Choi Syndicate's ultimate authority. He held it out to me,
his palm open, a silent offering of a life I had never dared to imagine while scrubbing tables. I'm not asking you to be my driver, or my shadow, or my secret. I'm asking you to sit at the head of the table, to be the queen of a new kind of dynasty, one that doesn't just take, but protects. I looked at the seal, then up at the man who had turned my world into a battlefield and then handed me the map. My mother's future was secure, my deaths were paid in blood, and the invisibility of my old life was a ghost I had finally laid to rest. I took the seal, my fingers closing over the cold stone. "Then let's get to work," I replied. The sun began to bleed over the Atlanta skyline, hitting the glass towers like a promise. The waitress was dead. Long live the queen.